Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. A reading from Exodus. The angel of the Lord is a mysterious figure in the Hebrew Bible. What do you make of it? It is just one of the topics which David Wilhite and Adam Winn take up in their new book, Israel's Lord, Yahweh is Two Powers in Second Temple Literature. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. The Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. This network is committed to bringing church leaders great resources as they are on the cutting edge of culture and ministry today. In particular, the Stone Chapel Podcast is about exploring the Bible and theology with some of the best scholars in the world. For more information, you can go to ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. This episode is part one of a two-part conversation with two scholars, David Wilhite and Adam Winn. They're working together on a project, 3 books in all with Fortress Press, to come to grips with the question of God in Second Temple Judaism. That's a pretty big subject. Now, Second Temple Judaism is that part about 400 to 500 years before the New Testament and including the New Testament. But it's also about God in the New Testament and the early church. There's no more important subject in all of the world, it seems to me. So today, a discussion of Israel's Lord with David Wilhite and Adam Winn here on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Hello, my name is David Wilhite. I teach historical theology and especially focus on early Christianity at Truett Theological Seminary of Baylor University.
Adam Winn. I am the S. Lewis and Ann W. Armstrong Professor at Samford University, but also the Department Chair of the Biblical and Religious Studies Departments. And I also, as a professor, teach New Testament courses.
David Wilhite, Adam Winn, welcome to our podcast, the Stone Chapel Podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Very delighted to be here.
We're going to be talking about your book here in just a minute, but there are people listening to this podcast, I bet, who have never heard of David Wilhite or don't know much about him, or Adam Winn. Let's let people get to know you. David, for those who don't know you, who are you?
I'm a husband. I'm a father of 2, boy and a girl. Well, man and a woman now. They're both in college. And as I said, I teach at Baylor University, at the seminary there. I'm originally from Georgia. All my extended family's in Alabama. I lived in Alabama 6 years and went to school ultimately in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews, and then landed here in Texas and have been here for almost 18 years. And I just try to stay busy with work and family. And when I'm not doing that stuff, I love anything involving the outdoors.
Oh, cool. Now, what part of Georgia are you from? Because I'm from Atlanta area.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm from the South, from Columbus, Georgia, right along the Alabama border.
All right. Okay, good. Yeah, I love Georgia. I love the people. I love the sweet tea. I love all that stuff, that you get there. Adam, how about you? For those who don't know Adam Winn, who is he?
Yeah, I also am a husband and a father of only one, about to be a college student, about to send my daughter off to college.
Wow.
And I have lived all over the place. I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. Teaching-wise, I taught at Azusa Pacific University. I spent many years at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor, and I am in Birmingham, Alabama, where I am for the first time serving as a department chair. And I love being at Samford. It's a wonderful school. Areas of focus, I've written a lot on the Gospel of Mark. Done a lot on the New Testament's engagement with the Roman imperial world. Recently, or more recently, a lot of work on early Christology and Jewish monotheism.
Fascinating. I'm deeply interested in those kind of questions as well, and I think our audience is too. You guys together have written a book called Israel's Lord, Yahweh as Two Powers in Second Temple Literature, published by Fortress Press. How did you guys team up to do this particular book?
Adam and I have been friends for a long time now. So he is the New Testament expert, and I am the guy who does stuff dealing with after the New Testament. And for years, I was goading Adam and trying to convince him of this idea that when the earliest Christians talked about Jesus as Lord, they really meant Jesus is like the Lord you read about in the Old Testament, Yahweh. I finally, after years, brought Adam around and convinced him. That's my one triumph here. Now, the problem, I have to admit, is what I was trying to say was a very blunt and unsophisticated argument. And so after, I don't know, Adam, how long? About at least 5 years or more, we talking about this.
Yeah,
we came around.
It was a long conversation.
We came around at one point, I don't know who thought of it first, but we realized, like, we actually have something here. We've refined this argument, and we've really got something to contribute. So we said, let's do a book. And
Adam, you want to add to that?
Yeah, David Wilhite is very persuasive and did finally bend me around to this view. And I think it's right. How would it actually work? And then to begin to think about Second Temple Judaism and start to explore. And I think that's where things really begin to get fruitful for us.
So you guys have been collaborating on this for quite a while. Now, this book that we're talking about, Israel's Lord, this is part one, part two. How does it work with other things that you're planning right now?
I should say maybe this is the question that started us, is how is it that when early Christians looked to their Old Testament, what are called the theophanies, the appearances of God, unanimously, the early Christians after the New Testament period are looking at those appearances of God as always being God the Son, not God the Father, the way most of us modern Christians think about that. So when God walks in the garden with Adam and Eve, that's God the Son. When God appears on Mount Sinai to Moses in the burning bush, that's God the Son, et cetera, et cetera. So our question kind of was, where did this come from? We wanted to do was back this up and say, yes, this is actually found, not in all, but in many of our New Testament texts. They're assuming the same thing. And we needed to really lay the groundwork for that. And that became a huge project. And so Adam actually was the one who was able to orchestrate us getting 3 different book contracts with Fortress Academic. And so, yeah, the first one is where we do most of the background to the New Testament to set up our kind of our bigger project.
The 2 more books to come after this one.
2 more. Okay. Are they every other year, every 4th year? Do you have a kind of a timeline in?
We wish we did. Well, we do. Our publisher thinks that we do. But I don't know. What do we say? Summer 26, David, is when we're hoping to have the manuscript of the next book.
That's correct. Yeah, not this year, but the next year we have it in there.
Let's start diving in. In the title, you talk about Yahweh as two powers. That language is familiar to me because I read Alan Siegel's book many, many years ago. That was my first sort of introduction to that language. Start with Adam on this. Adam, what do you mean by two powers? Yahweh as two powers.
Well, I think we should start by saying we really begin to look at Second Temple Judaism and the monotheism of Second Temple Judaism and look at the various pieces of evidence that we have there related to how Jews understood the God of Israel. And what we begin to look at, and this is a long debate, Larry Todd has been involved in this debate, Crispin Fletcher Lewis has been involved in this debate. What is the nature of Jewish monotheism during this time? And scholars have often offered a variety of different ways of understanding it, right? Hurtado, Richard Bauckham offer this kind of exclusive monotheism where there's strict boundary markers between the God of Israel and between everything else,
Mm-hmm.
right? Bound for Hurtado, worship seems to be the primary boundary marker. Bauckham would acknowledge worship as a boundary marker, but would emphasize the act of creation as a boundary marker. Yahweh creates, nothing else creates.
Mm-hmm.
Sovereignty over creation. So Yahweh is sovereign over creation, closely associates the throne of God with this. Yahweh sits on the throne in heaven. No one else sits on the throne in heaven. A lot of evidence from the Second Temple period supports this, right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that leans in that direction and supports their conclusions. But then also at the same time, there's these nasty exceptions, I think, to those conclusions as well. The Enochic Son of Man in Bockham's first work on this said the Enochic Son of Man was equivocally part of the divine identity because he looks like he sits on the divine throne and maybe receives worship. He's equivocally a part, and then he's the exception that proves the rule. And other scholars pushed back, like Crispin Fletcher Lewis, that says, wait a minute, how is he the exception that proves the rule? Why doesn't he break the rule? I mean, what does it disprove the rule? You have figures like that, the Enochic Son of Man. You have things like Word and Wisdom and Philo and different things that seem like they create or they're involved in creation. Angel of the Lord traditions, various angelic figures, these sorts of things. There's these kind of flies in the ointment that you're trying to navigate. And then there's an alternative side, another group that takes these exceptions and says, well, maybe monotheism was more inclusive. Maybe there weren't these hard and fast boundaries. Maybe the God of Israel could share worship with someone, or he could share the act of creation, or could share sovereignty, these sorts of things. And we also note that has weaknesses as well, because, well, that explains the exceptions pretty well, but it does a really bad job of explaining the rules that Hurtado and Bauckham point out. If Yahweh can share, well, then why don't we see more broad sharing in terms of worship or expressions of cult or these sorts of things? And so those are the poles we're kind of navigating, this exclusive monotheism versus inclusive monotheism, and trying to say, how can we resolve this tension? And what we do is we look ahead and say, maybe we can find something in later rabbinic Judaism that can help us out to resolve this. And this is where we look at the kind of the work of Siegel, the work of Daniel Bayarin, and say, hey, in the rabbinic period, they're talking about two powers, right? They're talking about the existence of two powers, where it seems like they understand that the one God of Israel exists in terms of two in some way. And so that's where we get that language of two powers and say, hey, and we're not the first people to do this. So Boyarin does this, Siegel does this. Hey, maybe that's not just a rabbinic phenomenon. Maybe that's a phenomenon that existed in the Second Temple period. And maybe it was an acceptable version of Judaism. That's kind of how we get to two powers and what we mean by two powers. Is that helpful?
I think it's very helpful because you're explaining a lot of phenomena, a lot of data through what becomes later the language of the two powers. Which now you're not talking necessarily about two gods, are you? At that point, not two gods.
We are not talking about two gods,
because sometimes people might hear that and wonder, does that mean there's two co-equal, separate, distinct powers? Is that what you're talking about?
The reason it's in the rabbinic literature is the rabbis are rejecting two powers. There can only be one, and they seem to mean one God. So there can't be a second God. If you're worshiping another person on another throne in heaven, they're saying that's outside the bounds of the one God. Well, that's understandable. We look to the earlier sources, though, and you find Jews prior to the New Testament who keep using this sort of second figure. Mm-hmm. And Philo is a sort of famous example. Philo is a Jewish writer writing in Greek. He from Alexandria. Philo will talk about the Logos, the Word of God, as if he is God on earth, doing all the things God's supposed to do on earth, even sitting in the temple, getting worshipped. I mean, all of these things. And at one point, he's even asked the question, do you believe in two gods? And he says he doesn't prefer two gods, but two powers. Again, we don't try to explain all the relationships here, but that even though Jews would not want to think of a second God, God is somehow in heaven and transcendent and beyond us. And God is also somehow sent or is present as this second power who operates on earth, whether that's the Word of God, the wisdom of God, the angel of the Lord. This second figure goes under several different titles, which we try to unpack in our book.
I've always been fascinated with this angel of the Lord figure. We see it back in Genesis, the first times. I mean, really would appreciate, Adam, if you'd give us kind of your idea of what's happening. It seems like the angel is there, let's say in the burning bush, and yet it is God who speaks from the midst of the bush. So it seems like
Right.
it's both the angel of the Lord, but it's also God himself. How do you guys look at that? That's one of those theophanic or theophanies that are sometimes described.
Yeah, that's right. Let me first off say we are trying to answer that question from the perspective of Second Temple Jews. And so we don't try and answer that question from the perspective of the author of Exodus.
Okay.
So we're careful there.
Okay.
I just read this text this morning. It's interesting you bring it up. It's the angel of the Lord appears in the burning bush, and then it's Yahweh that speaks. Yahweh speaks from the burning bush. And so there's a lot of different places where it almost seems like the angel of the Lord and Yahweh are synonymous. And what we would argue, or we think we see in the Second Temple literature, is we see, however the original author would understand that, it seems like there are many Second Temple Jews that are looking at that and understanding that in terms of the angel of the Lord is the Yahweh that is present to Moses. You can say the angel of the Lord, and you can say the Lord speaks, because the angel of the Lord and the Lord are understood as one in some sense, but in another sense distinct. David talked about Philo. Interestingly, Philo talks about the Logos, but for Philo, the Logos is also the angel of the Lord. It has this distinct identity. It's the Logos and as the angel of the Lord that's operating in the burning bush. It's the Yahweh that is present with Israel. We think Second Temple Jews understood the angel of the Lord as the Lord, but it's distinguished because of immanence versus transcendence. Now I'm going to hand it over to David because he did more of the work on the angel of the Lord chapter than I did.
You handled it well. One of the things we have to admit, whether it's trying to read the Old Testament or trying to read the New Testament, is what scholars are trying to avoid. And this may not be the case for all of your audience, but what scholars are sort of trained to do is not take the Trinitarianism that was formulated in the early church and impose that on the biblical text. So if you assume that ancient Jews weren't Trinitarian in the time of Exodus, well, then there must be one God. Except for what you point out, David, that there's all these strange texts of the angel of the Lord where the angel of the Lord is called the Lord and speaks as if he's the Lord and acts like the Lord. Is it just the Lord appearing as an angel? Well, no, because the angel refers to the Lord. So there's not one but two. And again, Christian listeners are going to be anticipating, wait, where's the third? Where's the Holy Spirit? We're not trying to sort all of that out. As Adam said, we're trying to say, okay, these confusing texts from the Hebrew Bible, where this angel of the Lord is a second figure who is also called the Lord, Yahweh. How did Jews in the time of the New Testament writers understand them? All we can do is look at the texts that were available and see what they were doing with these texts. So, for example, there's a third Enoch, which is later, it's rabbinic, but third Enoch is a Jewish text where there is this angelic heavenly figure. It seems to be the angel of the Lord under this new angel's name, a new name, I should say, Metatron. And he's called in one part, the younger Yahweh. So there's Yahweh and younger Yahweh. The angel of the Lord is the lesser one. So we're not saying that's orthodoxy. We're not saying that everybody in the Second Temple understood it that way, but we're trying to sort through all of these clues as to how could New Testament writers have read those texts.
Well, it's a fascinating book. We're going to continue this conversation in the next podcast, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these categories that you've mentioned. And at the same time, I'd like to get a little hint of what's coming and how this is going to be figuring in to what we find in the New Testament when Jesus is now treated as God and worshiped and prayed to, and there's a feast in his honor and those kinds of things that are typically associated in that time and culture with divinity. So we'll come back to that. Thank you guys for being here for part one. Part two is on its way.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That is part one of my conversation with Adam Winn and David Wilhite. They make a great team. Next time, Israel's Lord, part two. Thanks to my sweet wife, Kathy, for her excellent work in editing this podcast. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Thanks to Jessica Mauser and Jenna Firestone for their help in this production. This podcast is made possible by the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. Come by and visit when you are in Southeast Texas. We'd love to see you. If you haven't subscribed to this podcast, please do, and tell those in your ministry circle. If you haven't rated this podcast yet, it's time to do so. Go ahead right now. I'll wait. Hey, thanks for that 5-star rating. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.